Chapter 1. The Inventor's Dilemma. The year was 1942. War was raging across the world. People were scared. Cities were bombed. Families were torn apart. It was a time of fear and desperation. Far away from the battles, in the quiet deserts of New Mexico, a man worked tirelessly. His name was J. Robert Oppenheimer. He was a physicist, a scientist who studied the tiniest parts of the universe. Oppenheimer was smart, maybe too smart for his own good. People said he was a genius. But being a genius wasn't always easy. Oppenheimer had been chosen for a top-secret mission. The government called it the Manhattan Project. Most people didn't even know it existed. It was that secret. The goal of the project was unbelievable: to create a bomb unlike any other. A bomb so powerful it could end the war. Oppenheimer didn't work alone. He had a team of brilliant scientists from all over the world. They came to a place called Los Alamos, hidden in the desert. There were no big cities nearby, no prying eyes, just sand, mountains, and the sound of the wind. The scientists worked day and night. They used huge machines and strange materials. Some of these materials were so dangerous that even touching them could be deadly. They were trying to unlock the power inside atoms, the tiny building blocks of everything around us. At first, Oppenheimer was excited. He believed in science. He thought this project would save lives. The war had already killed so many people. He wanted to stop it. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Oppenheimer began to feel uneasy. He watched his team as they made progress. They were getting closer and closer to creating the bomb. The scientists cheered when their experiments worked, but Oppenheimer didn't cheer. He sat quietly, thinking. "What are we doing?" he whispered to himself late one night. The room was dark, except for the soft glow of his desk lamp. He looked at the papers in front of him. They were filled with numbers and diagrams, numbers that told him how powerful this bomb would be. Diagrams that showed how it would explode. He thought about the people in the cities where this bomb might be used. They had families, children, friends, just like him. Would they all be gone in an instant? The scientists at Los Alamos didn't see much of the outside world. They weren't allowed to talk about their work. Letters were checked before they could be sent. No one could visit unless they had special permission. It was lonely. Sometimes Oppenheimer missed his family. He missed the simple days before the war when he could just focus on teaching and research. But now he was part of something bigger, much bigger. One day, a test was planned. The scientists wanted to see if their bomb would actually work. The test was called Trinity. They set up a site in the desert. They built a steel tower and placed the bomb on top. Then they waited. On the morning of July 16th, 1945, Oppenheimer stood with his team miles away from the test site. The sun hadn't risen yet. The air was cold. Everyone was quiet, nervous. A voice on the radio began counting down. 10, 9, 8. Oppenheimer held his breath. 3, 2, 1. Suddenly, the desert lit up as if the sun had exploded. A blinding flash filled the sky. A huge fireball rose into the air, turning everything orange, red, and yellow. The ground shook. A giant mushroom-shaped cloud formed. The scientists watched in awe. Some clapped. Others cheered. They had done it. The bomb worked. But Oppenheimer didn't clap. He didn't cheer. He stared at the explosion, his face pale. His heart raced. He thought of a line from an ancient text he had read. Quietly, he said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His words hung in the air, heavy and full of sadness. From that moment, Oppenheimer knew his life would never be the same. The bomb was real. It was powerful. Too powerful. He had helped create something that could destroy entire cities. Was this what he wanted? Days later, the scientists were told the bomb would be used in the war. They didn't know where. They didn't know when. But Oppenheimer knew it wouldn't be long. He tried to talk to the leaders. He wanted them to understand the bomb's power. He wanted them to think carefully before using it. But the decision was out of his hands. He was just a scientist. The military would decide. Oppenheimer returned to Los Alamos. He tried to focus on his work, but it was hard. He kept thinking about the test, about the explosion, about what it meant for the future. One night, he walked outside. The desert was quiet, except for the sound of the wind. He looked up at the stars. They were bright and beautiful, scattered across the dark sky. He wondered if the people in the cities far away were looking at the same stars. He wondered if they knew what was coming. Oppenheimer didn't sleep much after that. The weight of his invention was too heavy. Weeks later, the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Oppenheimer listened to the news in silence. The reporters described the devastation. Thousands of people were gone. A city was gone. He felt a deep sadness. He had hoped the bomb would end the war. But at what cost? Oppenheimer became a famous name after the war. People called him the father of the atomic bomb. But he didn't feel proud. He felt guilty. In the years that followed, Oppenheimer spoke out about the dangers of nuclear weapons. He warned people about what could happen if they were used again. He wanted the world to learn from Hiroshima. Still, he couldn't change the past. The bomb had changed the world forever. And it had changed him, too. As Oppenheimer grew older, he spent more time thinking. Thinking about science, thinking about life, thinking about his role in history. His story is one of brilliance and burden. A story of a man who changed the world, but carried the weight of that change for the rest of his life. Chapter 2. The World at War. The world was at war. It was a terrible time. Cities burned, families fled, millions of soldiers marched into battle. The war had started in 1939. It began in Europe. Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. Other countries, like Britain and France, tried to stop him. But Hitler's army was strong. His tanks rolled through cities. His planes bombed towns. People were afraid. Soon, the war spread. Japan, an ally of Germany, began expanding its empire. Japanese soldiers attacked countries across Asia. They wanted power and control. By 1941, the war was everywhere: Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. It was a world war. In America, people watched the news. They heard about battles far away, but the United States had not joined the war yet. Many Americans wanted to stay out of it. They thought it wasn't their fight. But everything changed on December 7th, 1941. Early that morning, Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, a naval base in Hawaii. Bombs rained down on the ships in the harbor. Explosions filled the air. Smoke rose into the sky. The attack killed over 2,000 people. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke to the nation the next day. His voice was strong, but there was sadness in it. He called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The United States could no longer stay out of the war. America had to fight back. And so, the war grew even larger. American soldiers joined the battles in Europe and the Pacific. They fought bravely, but the war was brutal. Cities were destroyed. Villages were burned. Millions of people, both soldiers and civilians, lost their lives. By 1945, after years of fighting, the Allies were starting to win. Germany was losing its power. Adolf Hitler was hiding in a bunker as Allied forces moved closer to Berlin. But in the Pacific, Japan was still fighting fiercely. Japanese soldiers refused to surrender. They fought until the very end. In battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, they showed incredible determination. American leaders realized that ending the war in Japan would not be easy. The question was this: how could they make Japan surrender? Some leaders thought they could win by continuing to fight on the ground. But this would mean more battles, more deaths. Others suggested bombing Japanese cities. Planes had already bombed Tokyo and other places, killing thousands of people. Still, Japan didn't give up. Then, there was another idea. A new kind of weapon. Something no one had seen before. The atomic bomb. The bomb had been created in secret during the Manhattan Project. Scientists like Robert Oppenheimer had worked on it for years. They believed it could be the most powerful weapon ever made. Some leaders were excited about the bomb. They thought it could end the war quickly. If they dropped it on a Japanese city, it might make Japan surrender. But others were unsure. "How many people will it kill?" one man asked. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands," came the answer. There were long debates in rooms filled with maps and charts. Some argued that using the bomb would save lives in the long run. They believed it would stop the need for a full invasion of Japan, which could kill even more people, both American and Japanese. Others hesitated. They thought about the innocent civilians who would be hurt: men, women, children. People who had nothing to do with the war. Was it right to use such a weapon? President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, faced a difficult decision. The war had already caused so much suffering. He wanted to end it, but at what cost? In the end, the decision was made. The bomb would be used. The military prepared 2 bombs. Each had a different design. The first was named Little Boy. It was small, but incredibly powerful. The second was called Fat Man. It was larger and shaped differently. The targets were chosen carefully. Military leaders wanted cities that had not been heavily bombed yet. They wanted to see the full effect of the atomic bomb. Hiroshima, a city in southern Japan, was at the top of the list. But even as the plans moved forward, some people felt uneasy. Scientists who had worked on the bomb wrote letters to Truman, asking him not to use it. They warned of the destruction it could cause. But it was too late. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay took off from an airfield. It carried Little Boy, the first atomic bomb. The plane flew high above the clouds, heading for Hiroshima. In the city below, people were just starting their day. Children walked to school. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Workers rode bicycles through the streets. They didn't know what was coming. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. It fell through the sky, silent at first. Then, a blinding flash, a massive explosion. The world seemed to stop. Hiroshima was gone in an instant. Buildings were flattened. Fires spread quickly, destroying everything in their path. Tens of thousands of people died immediately. Many more were injured. The city was unrecognizable. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Again, the destruction was unimaginable. Finally, Japan surrendered. The war was over. But the cost had been enormous. As news of the bomb spread, people around the world were shocked. Some called it a victory. Others called it a tragedy. Leaders began to wonder, had they opened a door they could never close? The world would never be the same again. Chapter 3. Hiroshima, a city full of life. Hiroshima was a city full of life. It sat by the sea, surrounded by green hills. The Ota River ran through the city, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. People called Hiroshima the City of Water. The river was a place for fishing, swimming, and playing. In the mornings, the streets were busy. Shopkeepers opened their doors. The smell of fresh bread filled the air. Children ran to school, their laughter echoing in the alleys. Workers cycled to factories, their bicycles rattling over the cobblestones. The war seemed far away. Kenji was 10 years old. He loved the river. Every afternoon after school, he ran to its edge. He skipped stones across the water, counting how many times they bounced before sinking. Kenji dreamed of being a fisherman like his father. His father had a small boat and worked on the river every day. "Someday," Kenji said, "I'll sail with you." His father just smiled and ruffled Kenji's hair. Across town, Emmy was helping her mother. Emmy was 12. She and her mother sold flowers in the market. Their stand was small, but it was always colorful. Roses, lilies, daisies, they sold them all. Emmy loved arranging the flowers. She liked to mix the colors, making each bouquet special. "Flowers make people happy," Emmy's mother said. Emmy believed her. She smiled every time a customer left with a bouquet. The people of Hiroshima lived simple lives. They worked hard, but found time for joy. Families ate together. Neighbors helped each other. Children played in the parks and along the streets. But even in this peaceful city, war was a shadow. At night, sirens sometimes wailed, warning of enemy planes. People hurried to shelters, carrying their children and a few belongings. The planes usually passed without dropping bombs, but the fear stayed. Kenji hated the sirens. They made his heart race. He didn't understand why people fought wars. "Why can't they stop?" he asked his father one night. His father sighed. "It's not that simple, Kenji. I wish it were." Emmy had questions too. She wondered why soldiers marched through the streets, their boots heavy on the ground. She wondered why rice was harder to buy and why everyone seemed worried about food. The war had changed things in Hiroshima. Factories now made weapons. Young men went off to fight and didn't come back. Everyone felt the strain. But still, life went on. The morning of August 6, 1945, was bright and clear. The sun rose over the hills, casting golden light on the city. Emmy woke early, as usual. She helped her mother arrange the flowers at their stand. Kenji had no school that day. It was summer, and the days were hot. He had planned to meet his friends by the river. He ran out of the house, waving goodbye to his mother. "Be careful," she called after him. The market was already busy. Emmy handed a bouquet to a smiling customer. Kenji's laughter echoed as he raced his friends. It felt like any other day. But above the city, something was different. High in the sky, a single plane flew. It wasn't like the others that came during air raids. This one was alone, quiet. It carried something new, something terrible. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell. Kenji and his friends heard the hum of the plane. They looked up, squinting into the sun. A bright flash lit the sky. It was so bright that Kenji had to close his eyes. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a loud roar. The ground shook. A wave of heat swept through the air. Buildings crumbled. Fires broke out everywhere. Kenji was thrown to the ground. Dust filled his mouth and nose. He opened his eyes and saw smoke rising into the sky. His friends were gone. "Mama!" he cried. He ran toward his home, but everything looked different. Streets were filled with rubble. People screamed and called for help. Emmy was at the market when the bomb exploded. She felt the heat first. It burned her arms. The next moment, everything was chaos. The flower stand was gone. Her mother was nowhere in sight. Emmy stumbled, coughing from the smoke. The city was unrecognizable. Hiroshima, the peaceful city by the river, was gone. Kenji wandered through the ruins. His feet were bare, and his clothes were torn. He saw people lying on the ground, their skin burned and their faces covered in ash. He tried to find his house, but there was nothing left. Emmy searched for her mother. She called her name over and over, but there was no answer. Tears ran down her face, mixing with the dust. She held a single flower in her hand, a rose that somehow survived the blast. As the hours passed, the survivors gathered near the river. Many were injured. Some were silent, staring into the water. Others cried out in pain. Kenji and Emmy found each other there. They didn't know each other before that day, but now they were both alone. Kenji held Emmy's hand. "We'll find them," he said. "We'll find our families." Emmy nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. The river, once a place of joy, was now filled with debris. Boats carried the injured to safety. The water, once clear, was dark with ash. Hiroshima had been a city full of life. Now, it was a city of loss. But even in the darkness, there was a flicker of hope. Emmy looked at the rose in her hand. It was bruised and wilted, but it was still there. "Maybe we can start again," she whispered. Kenji squeezed her hand. "Maybe," he said. Together, they watched the sun set over the ruined city. The sky turned red and orange like the flames that had destroyed their home. But in the distance, stars began to appear. Hiroshima's story wasn't over. Chapter 4. The decision is made. The room was quiet, except for the sound of papers being shuffled. It was July 26, 1945. A group of military leaders and government officials sat around a large wooden table. In the center sat President Harry Truman. He looked tired. Maps covered the table. They showed the Pacific Ocean, dotted with small islands, and the country of Japan. Red lines marked battles fought and territories taken. The men studied the maps, their faces tense. The war had been long. It had been brutal. Truman listened as the men spoke. They were discussing a new weapon, the atomic bomb. It was unlike anything ever created before. One bomb could destroy an entire city. Some of the men argued in favor of using it. One general stood and pointed at the map. "Japan refuses to surrender," he said. "We've dropped thousands of bombs on their cities, and they still fight." His voice grew louder. "If we invade, it will cost us hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe more. The bomb can end the war quickly." Another man, a scientist, frowned. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Yes, it can," he said softly, "but at what cost?" He looked around the room. "Do you understand what this bomb will do? It will kill tens of thousands of people. Innocent people, children, families. They will die in seconds." The room fell silent. Truman leaned back in his chair. He rubbed his temples. The weight of the decision was heavy. He'd become president just a few months earlier, after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death. Now, he faced one of the most difficult choices in history. The war had already claimed millions of lives. Soldiers had fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. The Allies had defeated Germany, but Japan refused to surrender. Battles in the Pacific were fierce. American soldiers fought for every inch of land. Many never returned home. Truman thought about the letters he had received from families. Mothers begging for their sons to come home. Wives asking why their husbands had to fight so far away. He wanted to end the war. But how? The generals continued to speak. "The Japanese military is strong," one said. "They will never surrender willingly. They believe it's better to die than to give up. An invasion could take years." Another added, "We've tried everything else. We've warned them. We've bombed their cities. But still, they fight." The scientist spoke again. His voice was firm. "If we drop this bomb," he said, "we will change the world forever. No one will forget what we've done." Truman stared at the map in front of him. His hand hovered over it. He thought about the Japanese people. He thought about the American soldiers still fighting. His heart ached. "What if we warn them?" one man asked. "Tell them about the bomb. Give them a chance to surrender." "We've already warned them," another replied. "They haven't listened." Truman closed his eyes. He imagined the destruction the bomb would cause. He imagined the fires, the rubble, the screams. He opened his eyes and looked at the faces around the table. Finally, he spoke. His voice was steady but quiet. "We will use the bomb." The room was silent. Some men nodded. Others stared at the table. The decision had been made. Truman stood and left the room. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing. Outside, the summer sun was bright, but Truman felt no warmth. He thought about the people of Hiroshima, though he didn't know their names. He thought about the children playing in the streets, the families sitting down to breakfast. He wondered if they had any idea what was coming. Back in the room, the generals began making plans. They chose 2 cities as targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both were important to Japan's war effort. Hiroshima was a large city with military factories. Nagasaki was another key industrial center. The bomb would be ready soon. The scientists at Los Alamos had worked hard to build it. They called it Little Boy. It was small, but its power was unimaginable. The plan was simple. A plane would carry the bomb over the target city. The crew would release it, and it would fall silently through the air. When it exploded, it would create a massive fireball. The heat would be so intense that buildings would melt. People near the explosion would vanish in an instant. The men in the room spoke in calm, measured tones. They used words like targets and casualties, but deep down, they knew this was no ordinary mission. The next day, Truman gave a speech to the American people. He didn't tell them about the bomb, not yet. Instead, he spoke about the war. "We are nearing the end," he said. "Our brave soldiers are fighting to bring peace to the world." The people listening didn't know the secret plan. They didn't know what was about to happen. As the days passed, the preparations continued. The bomb was loaded onto a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay. The crew was briefed. They were told this mission would change history. The men followed orders, but they felt the weight of their task. One pilot wrote in his journal, "I hope this works. I hope it ends the war, but I'm afraid of what we're about to do." On the night of August 5th, the Enola Gay took off from an airfield. The bomb sat in the belly of the plane, surrounded by wires and machinery. The crew was quiet as the plane climbed into the sky. As they flew toward Hiroshima, President Truman waited. He knew the bomb would soon be dropped. He knew the war might end because of it. But he also knew the destruction it would cause. He sat alone in his office, staring at a photograph of his family. He thought about the future. Would people see him as a hero, or would they blame him for what he had done? The decision had been made. Now there was no turning back. Chapter 5. August 6th, 1945. Morning in Hiroshima. The morning of August 6, 1945 was calm in Hiroshima. The sky was clear, painted a soft blue. The summer sun was already warm, promising another hot day. People began their routines, unaware that this day would be like no other. Emmy woke early. Her mother was already in the kitchen, preparing food for the market. Emmy stretched and smiled. She loved mornings in Hiroshima. The streets came alive with the sounds of neighbors talking, children laughing, and shopkeepers opening their stores. By the river, Kenji was already outside. He had a smooth, flat stone in his hand. He loved skipping stones across the water. He held his breath as he threw it. 1, 2, 3 skips. Then it sank. He grinned. "I'll get 5 next time," he said to himself. In the heart of the city, shopkeepers arranged their goods. The baker set fresh bread in the window. A man selling fish called out his prices. The air smelled of rice and miso soup from homes nearby. Life was simple. Life was peaceful. But high above the city, something unusual was happening. At 8:15 a.m., a plane appeared in the sky. It was silver and shiny, its wings reflecting the sunlight. The people of Hiroshima looked up. Planes had flown over before, but this one was different. It was alone. There were no sirens, no warning. Emmy stood in the market, holding a bunch of flowers. She squinted at the sky. "Is that a bomber?" she asked her mother. Her mother frowned, but said nothing. Kenji and his friends stopped playing. They pointed at the plane. "What's it doing up there?" one boy asked. Inside the plane, the crew released the bomb. It fell silently through the air, spinning as it dropped. Then it happened. A blinding flash lit up the sky. It was brighter than the sun. Emmy dropped her flowers and covered her eyes. "Mama!" she cried. Kenji felt the heat on his face before he heard the sound. It was like standing too close to a fire. He turned to run, but the ground shook beneath him. A deafening roar followed. The bomb exploded with unimaginable force. The air filled with fire and smoke. Buildings crumbled. Streets disappeared. People screamed, but their voices were lost in the noise. Emmy and her mother were thrown to the ground. The market, once full of color and life, was gone. Wooden stalls were broken into splinters. Fires spread quickly, turning everything to ash. Kenji lay on the ground near the river. His ears rang. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it hard to see. He called out, "Mama! Papa!" But no one answered. The center of Hiroshima was destroyed in seconds. A massive mushroom cloud rose into the sky, dark and terrifying. The city was unrecognizable. Emmy struggled to stand. Her arms were burned and her clothes were torn. She turned in circles, looking for her mother. "Mama!" she cried again, but there was no response. Kenji stumbled through the rubble. The river, once so clean and clear, was now filled with debris. He saw people running, their faces pale and covered in ash. Some were badly burned. Others sat on the ground, silent and still. The heat was unbearable. Fires raged through the city, destroying anything that had survived the initial blast. Emmy grabbed a piece of cloth and covered her mouth. She had to find her mother. As Kenji wandered, he saw things he would never forget. A man carried a child in his arms, their faces blackened by the explosion. A woman sat in the middle of the street, staring at her burned hands. The survivors made their way to the river. They hoped to find relief from the heat and fire. Some jumped into the water, their skin blistered and peeling. Others drank from the river, even though it was dark with ash. Emmy reached the riverbank. She saw people lying in rows, their bodies twisted and broken. She felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop searching. Kenji saw Emmy. She was standing alone, holding a single flower. It was crushed and wilted, but she held onto it tightly. He walked toward her. "Are you okay?" he asked. Emmy shook her head. "I can't find my mother," she said. Her voice was shaking. "I can't find my family either," Kenji said. He reached out and took her hand. "Let's look together." They walked through the ruins, stepping over broken wood and glass. The air smelled of smoke and burning. The sun was still shining, but it felt cold. Hours passed, but they found no sign of their families. They sat down by the river, exhausted. Emmy's hands trembled as she looked at the flower. "This is all I have left," she whispered. Kenji didn't know what to say. He looked at the water, his reflection blurred by the ripples. "What happened to us?" he asked softly. Neither of them had an answer. As the day turned to evening, the fires began to die down. The sky, once bright and blue, was now dark and heavy with smoke. Stars appeared, faint and distant. Kenji and Emmy stayed by the river. They were too tired to move, too scared to leave. The city around them was silent, except for the crackling of flames. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but they knew Hiroshima would never be the same again. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, It may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. The Bomb Explodes. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the world changed forever. Above Hiroshima, the atomic bomb exploded. The air itself seemed to ignite. In an instant, the sky turned brighter than the sun. It was blinding. No one could look at it for more than a second. The explosion sent a wave of heat across the city. It was hotter than anything anyone had ever felt. Roofs caught fire. Trees burst into flames. Clothes burned right off people's bodies. Kenji was by the river. He had just bent down to pick up a stone when the flash came. He froze. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Then the heat hit him. It was like a giant hand pushing him to the ground. His ears rang. His skin burned. "Papa! Mama!" he screamed. His voice cracked with fear. But there was no answer. In the market, Emmy clutched her bouquet of flowers. She had been looking up at the strange plane in the sky. Now her hands burned. The flowers in her grip turned black and crumbled into ash. "Mama!" she cried, falling to the ground. She looked around, but everything was chaos. Stalls had disappeared. People ran in every direction, screaming. Her mother was gone. The explosion flattened buildings near the center of the city. Houses were reduced to rubble. Factories collapsed, burying workers inside. Streets disappeared under mountains of broken wood and stone. Farther away, windows shattered. Doors blew off their hinges. People were thrown through the air like leaves in a storm. A massive mushroom cloud rose high into the sky. It was dark and terrifying, with shades of black, gray, and orange. The cloud grew taller and taller, spreading like an umbrella over the ruined city. For a moment, there was silence. The sound of the explosion had been deafening, but now it was gone. The silence was eerie. Then came the cries. People screamed for help. Some shouted names, searching for loved ones. Others moaned in pain, unable to move. Many didn't make a sound. They lay where they had fallen, too weak or injured to cry out. Kenji sat up slowly. His hands trembled. His knees were scraped and bleeding. Around him, everything was broken. Trees lay on the ground, their branches burned. The river was dark and full of debris. "Papa!" he shouted again. His voice echoed, but no one answered. He stood up and tried to run toward his house, but the streets were gone. It was hard to know where he was. Emmy crawled out from under a piece of wood. Her arms were burned, and her legs felt heavy. She coughed, her throat dry from the smoke in the air. She looked for her mother, but she couldn't see her. The market was gone. Fires began to spread. The heat from the bomb had started hundreds of small fires. Now they grew larger, feeding on the wooden buildings. Flames leapt into the air, turning the sky red and orange. The smell of burning wood filled the city. But it wasn't just wood. Emmy covered her nose with her sleeve. The smell made her stomach turn. Kenji tried to walk, but his feet hurt. He looked down and saw that his sandals were gone. The ground was hot, covered in ash and broken glass. People around him were badly hurt. Some had burns on their faces and arms. Their clothes were torn, their skin blistered. Others looked like they were asleep, lying still on the ground. But Kenji knew they weren't asleep. He saw a woman holding a baby. She stumbled as she walked, her hair burned off. She didn't speak. Her eyes stared straight ahead. The baby in her arms was silent. Emmy reached what used to be a street. She saw people gathered by a well. They were trying to splash water on their burns. Some drank the water, even though it was dirty. "Please, help me," Emmy whispered. But no one looked at her. Everyone was trying to survive. The city that had been so full of life that morning was now silent, except for the cries of the injured. Kenji stopped by a fallen tree. He leaned against it, breathing hard. His legs felt weak. His hands were shaking. He wanted to cry, but no tears came. "Where is everyone?" he whispered. He thought about his father, out on the river. He thought about his mother, who had been at home. Were they safe? Were they even alive? Emmy stumbled down another street. She clutched a broken piece of wood for balance. She saw a man sitting on the ground, his head in his hands. He was crying softly. The fires grew stronger. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see and even harder to breathe. Kenji covered his mouth with his hand. His throat felt dry and raw. Above the city, the mushroom cloud still loomed. It was a symbol of destruction, visible for miles. People from towns far away saw it and wondered what had happened. Emmy reached the riverbank. She saw people lying in rows. Some were moaning. Others were silent. She knelt by the water and splashed it on her face. It was warm, not cool. Kenji followed the sound of the river. He didn't know where else to go. When he reached the water, he saw Emmy. She was sitting alone, her head bowed. He walked over to her. "Are you okay?" he asked. She looked up. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. "No," she said. "Me neither," Kenji said. They sat together by the river. Around them, the city burned. The cries of the injured faded as night approached. The atomic bomb had turned Hiroshima into ruins. Thousands of people were gone. Those who survived would never forget. Kenji and Emmy didn't speak. They stared at the river, their reflections blurred by ripples. The sky above them was dark, but in the distance, stars began to appear. A new day would come. But for Hiroshima, nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 7. Inside the military rooms. Far away from Hiroshima, in a quiet military room, men waited. The room was dimly lit. Maps covered the walls and the long table in the center. Radios buzzed softly with static. Cigarette smoke lingered in the air. The men were tense. They had been planning this mission for weeks, but now all they could do was wait. General Leslie Groves sat at the head of the table. He had been in charge of the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program that created the atomic bomb. His face was serious, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Beside him sat President Harry Truman's advisors. They had come to hear the news firsthand. Everyone in the room knew this day would be remembered in history. A young officer adjusted the radio. The crackling grew louder. The men leaned forward, straining to hear. The mission had begun hours ago when the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber, had left the airfield. Now they waited for word of its success. Suddenly, a voice came through the static. It was calm and steady, but the message it carried was not. The mission was successful. The room fell silent. No one cheered. No one smiled. The words hung in the air like a weight. General Groves nodded slowly. He didn't speak. He stared at the map in front of him, tracing his finger over the red circle that marked Hiroshima. He knew what successful meant. It meant destruction. It meant death. One of the advisors took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Another lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. No one seemed to know what to say. "What about the city?" a man finally asked. The voice on the radio answered, "The bomb detonated as planned. Hiroshima is heavily damaged." There was a pause. Then, more softly, "The city is gone." The men in the room exchanged glances. They had expected this. They had planned for this. But hearing it was different. One of the officers spoke up. His voice was low. "How many casualties?" "We don't have exact numbers," the radio operator replied. "Tens of thousands. Maybe more." The room grew even quieter. The only sound was the soft hum of the radio. General Groves stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was shining. Birds chirped in the trees. It was a peaceful scene, far removed from the chaos in Hiroshima. He thought about the people in the city, families, children, people who had started their day like any other. Now, their lives were gone, or changed forever. One of the advisors broke the silence. "It's over," he said. His voice was flat, almost emotionless. "The war will end soon." Another man nodded. "Japan can't fight after this. They'll surrender." But not everyone was so certain. A younger officer spoke hesitantly. "What if they don't surrender? What if we have to drop another bomb?" The room tensed again. The possibility hung over them like a shadow. They had another bomb ready. It was waiting for orders. General Groves turned back to the table. His face was unreadable. He was a man of action, used to making decisions. But this moment was different. He felt the weight of what they had done. "The decision wasn't ours to make," one of the advisors said quietly. "It was the president's." "But we built it," another replied. His voice was sharp, almost angry. "We made this happen." They all fell silent again. Each man was lost in his own thoughts. They had worked for years to create the bomb. They had believed it would save lives by ending the war quickly. But now, as they thought about Hiroshima, they wondered if they had done the right thing. "We did what we had to do," General Groves finally said. His voice was firm, but there was a hint of doubt. The Japanese wouldn't surrender. An invasion would have cost even more lives, ours and theirs. The others nodded slowly. They wanted to believe him. But the image of Hiroshima, the city in ruins, the people suffering, was hard to ignore. As the hours passed, more reports came in. The fires in Hiroshima were spreading. The city was in chaos. Rescue efforts were nearly impossible. The heat from the explosion had turned the ground to ash. One man stood and began pacing the room. "This will change everything," he said. "The world will never be the same." He was right. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of power and destruction. It had ended one war, but it had started a new era. "Other countries will want this weapon," another man said. His voice was heavy with worry. What happens when they have it? What happens when it's used again? No one had an answer. General Groves sat back down and folded his hands. He thought about the scientists who had built the bomb, men like Oppenheimer. They had been proud of their work, but now he wondered if they felt proud or guilty. One of the advisors looked at the clock. It was late, but no one felt like leaving. The weight of their decision filled the room. Far away in Hiroshima, the fires continued to burn. The survivors searched for loved ones. The injured cried out for help. The dead lay silent. The men in the military room couldn't see it. They couldn't hear the screams or smell the smoke. But they felt the consequences of their actions. The voice on the radio crackled again. "Do you have further orders?" General Groves hesitated before answering. "Not yet," he said. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For a moment, the room was quiet again, but the silence was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the weight of what they had done. A city lay in ruins. Tens of thousands were dead, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Hiroshima was gone. The streets were no longer streets. They were piles of rubble and ash. Buildings that once stood tall were now twisted metal and broken wood. Smoke filled the air, rising high into the sky. The ground was hot, covered with debris. The city was silent, except for the soft cries of survivors. Kenji wandered through the ruins. His feet hurt, but he kept moving. His sandals were gone, and the ground burned his skin. His clothes were torn, and his arms stung from burns. He looked around, searching for his parents, but everything was unrecognizable. Houses were flattened, shops were destroyed. Even the river, his favorite place, looked strange. "Papa! Mama!" he shouted. His voice echoed, but no one answered. Kenji wasn't the only one searching. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage. Some called out for loved ones. Others didn't speak. They just stared, their faces blank. One woman held a baby in her arms. The baby didn't move. The woman walked slowly, as if she didn't know where to go. Kenji saw a man sitting on a broken wall. His head was in his hands, and his back was covered in burns. The man didn't look up when Kenji passed. In the distance, Kenji saw the market where Emmy and her mother sold flowers, or at least where the market used to be. Now it was just ash and rubble. He felt a lump in his throat. Emmy, he whispered. He didn't know if she was alive, but he had to find her. Emmy sat near what had been the riverbank. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and her head rested on her arms. Her clothes were singed, and her hair was covered in soot. She held something small and blackened in her hand, a flower. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She didn't make a sound. Kenji saw her and ran toward her. "Emmy!" he shouted. She looked up slowly. At first she didn't recognize him. His face was covered in dirt, and his hair was messy. But then she saw his eyes. "Kenji," she said softly. He knelt beside her. "Are you okay?" Emmy shook her head. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Kenji reached out and took her hand. It was burned, but he didn't let go. They sat together in silence, surrounded by the ruins of their city. "What happened?" Kenji whispered after a while. Emmy didn't answer. She just looked at the flower in her hand. It had been her favorite, a rose, but now it was dead, its petals blackened by the heat. "I can't find my parents," Kenji said. His voice was shaky. "Me neither," Emmy whispered. Her voice broke, and she began to cry. Kenji didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, but he wasn't sure it would be. The ground around them was littered with broken pieces of wood and metal. Smoke rose from fires that still burned in the distance. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds of ash. Some survivors gathered near the river. They splashed water on their burns, trying to cool the pain. Others lay on the ground, too weak to move. A boy about Kenji's age walked by, his arm wrapped in a piece of cloth. He didn't look at anyone. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the ground. Kenji held Emmy's hand tighter. "We have to find them," he said. Emmy nodded, but she didn't move. She was too tired, too hurt. They sat there for a long time, watching the world around them. People cried out for help, but there weren't enough doctors or nurses. The hospitals were gone. Kenji saw a man with a cart. He was picking up bodies and placing them carefully in the cart. The man's face was expressionless, but his hands trembled as he worked. "Do you think they're still alive?" Kenji asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emmy didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. The hours passed, but it felt like time had stopped. The fires burned and the smoke thickened. Kenji and Emmy didn't move from the riverbank. Eventually, a woman came by. She had a scarf wrapped around her face to block the smoke. She carried a small jug of water. "Drink," she said, handing the jug to Emmy. Emmy took a sip and passed it to Kenji. The water was warm and tasted like ash, but it soothed his dry throat. "Where are your parents?" the woman asked. "We don't know," Kenji said. His voice broke and tears filled his eyes. The woman nodded sadly. "Stay together," she said. "Don't get separated." Then she walked away, her footsteps slow and heavy. Kenji looked at Emmy. "We'll stay together," he said firmly. Emmy nodded again, but her eyes were filled with fear. The sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the ruined city. The fires still burned, but the flames seemed smaller now. The smoke rose into the darkening sky, mixing with the stars. Kenji and Emmy sat close, trying to keep warm. The night air was cold, and their clothes were thin and torn. "We'll find them," Kenji said again. He didn't know if it was true, but he wanted to believe it. Emmy leaned her head on his shoulder. "What if we don't?" she asked softly. Kenji didn't answer. He didn't want to think about that. As the night grew darker, the cries of the injured grew quieter. Many people were too weak to call out anymore. Some had already passed away. Kenji closed his eyes. He was exhausted, but every time he tried to sleep, he saw the flash of the bomb in his mind. He felt the heat, heard the roar, and saw the destruction. Emmy held on to the blackened flower. It was her only connection to the life she had known before. Hiroshima was unrecognizable. Streets, homes, and families were gone. But in the middle of the devastation, Kenji and Emmy had found each other. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but they knew they couldn't face it alone. Chapter 9. The Voice of the World. The news of Hiroshima traveled quickly. In just a few days, the entire world knew what had happened. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. Tens of thousands were dead. Many more were injured. Survivors spoke of unbearable heat, burning buildings, and families lost in an instant. The word Hiroshima would never be the same again. In Japan, the reaction was one of shock and horror. People could not believe that such a weapon existed. They had endured years of war. They had seen cities bombed and soldiers lost. But this was different. The survivors of Hiroshima, called hibakusha, shared their stories. Their burns were severe. Their homes were gone. Many were sick with a strange illness no one understood. Some felt fine at first, but grew weaker each day. Their hair fell out. Their skin blistered. Doctors didn't know how to treat them. The illness had a name: radiation sickness. The bomb had left behind invisible poison, and it was killing people slowly. In other parts of the world, the reactions were mixed. In the United States, some people celebrated. The newspapers called the bombing a victory. Headlines declared, "Japan must surrender," and "The war is over." Families of American soldiers felt relief. They hoped their loved ones could come home soon. Many believed the bomb had saved lives. They thought it had ended the war quickly, without the need for an invasion. But not everyone felt this way. Some Americans read about Hiroshima and felt uneasy. The pictures of burned buildings and injured children were hard to look at. Was this necessary? They asked. In Europe, where the war had already ended, people had mixed feelings. They were tired of war. They understood the need to stop Japan, but the stories from Hiroshima were horrifying. World leaders began to ask questions. They knew the bomb was powerful. They knew it had ended the war, but they also knew it had created something new: fear. Could it happen again? Countries wondered if the United States would use the bomb on them someday. Some began to think about building their own bombs. They wanted the same power. The atomic bomb wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. In Japan, the government was silent at first. They didn't know how to respond. The destruction of Hiroshima had left them stunned. 3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Thousands more were killed. Finally, on August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. The emperor spoke to the nation for the first time. His voice was calm, but the words were heavy. "We have endured the unendurable," he said. The world reacted to the surrender with relief. But the questions about Hiroshima didn't go away. Religious leaders called the bombing immoral. They said it was wrong to kill so many innocent people. Writers and artists created works about the tragedy, showing the pain of the survivors. Scientists who had worked on the bomb began to speak out. J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the bomb's inventors, said, "Now we know sin." He had once been proud of his work, but now he felt guilt. In the months after the bombing, journalists visited Hiroshima. They took photographs and wrote articles about what they saw. The images shocked the world. Burned bodies, collapsed buildings, children crying for their parents. For many people, these images were the first time they understood what the atomic bomb had done. The survivors of Hiroshima became symbols. They were reminders of what could happen if such a weapon was used again. Some spoke out, traveling the world to share their stories. Others stayed silent, unable to talk about their pain. Governments began to argue about the bomb. Should more be made? Should they ever be used again? The United Nations was formed after the war, and one of its first goals was to control nuclear weapons. But the damage was done. The atomic bomb had changed the world forever. The Cold War began soon after the end of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union became rivals. Both wanted to be the strongest country. Both began building more nuclear weapons. The world entered an age of fear. People worried about the next bomb. They built shelters and practiced drills. Children were taught to duck and cover in schools, as if hiding under a desk could protect them from a nuclear explosion. Hiroshima became a warning. Survivors urged people to remember what had happened. They wanted the world to learn from the tragedy. In Hiroshima itself, the city began to rebuild. It wasn't easy. The destruction was so complete that some thought the city should be abandoned. But the people of Hiroshima didn't give up. Slowly, they cleaned the rubble. They built new homes and planted trees. In 1949, the city was declared a city of peace. A memorial was built near the center of the explosion. It was called the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. Every year, people gather there to remember the victims. The park contains the A-bomb dome, a building that survived the blast. Its broken walls and exposed metal frame are a reminder of that terrible day. Nearby is the Children's Peace Monument, inspired by a young girl named Sadako who died from radiation sickness. Sadako had folded paper cranes, believing that if she folded 1,000 cranes, she would be cured. She didn't live to finish them, but her story touched the world. Today, people bring paper cranes to the monument as a sign of hope. The voice of Hiroshima is still heard. It speaks of loss and pain, but it also speaks of resilience and peace. Around the world, people continue to debate the bomb. Was it right? Was it wrong? Could there have been another way? These questions may never be answered. But one thing is clear. The atomic bomb changed everything. It ended a war. It began a new era. And it left a mark on humanity that will never be forgotten. Chapter 10. A Broken Japan. On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. For years, the country had fought. Soldiers had marched into battle. Cities had been bombed. Families had waited for their loved ones to return home. Many never did. The emperor's voice came over the radio. It was the first time the people of Japan had heard him speak. His voice was calm, but the words were heavy. "We must endure the unendurable," he said. Japan had lost. Across the country, people listened in silence. Some cried, others sat motionless, unable to process the news. The war had brought so much pain. But now it was finally over. Japan was broken. Cities lay in ruins. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, so many places had been bombed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were barely recognizable. Thousands were dead. Survivors wandered through the wreckage, searching for food, shelter, and loved ones. Kenji and Emi were among them. The two children had survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. They had lost their families, their homes, and everything they knew. Now, they sat in a small shelter made of scrap wood and metal. It wasn't much, but it kept out the wind and rain. The shelter was crowded with other survivors. Some were old, others were young, like Kenji and Emi. All of them looked tired. Their faces were pale. Their clothes were torn. Kenji sat with his knees pulled to his chest. His stomach growled loudly. He hadn't eaten much in days. He looked over at Emmy. She was staring at the floor, her hands resting in her lap. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Emmy nodded. "But there's nothing to eat," she said softly. Kenji sighed. He hated feeling so helpless. Before the bombing, his family had always had enough food. His mother cooked rice and fish every day. But now, even finding a handful of rice felt like a miracle. The adults in the shelter whispered to each other. They talked about the war, about what would happen next. "Everything is gone," one man said. "How can we survive?" "We'll survive," an old woman replied. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were determined. "We've been through hard times before. We can do it again." Emmy listened to their words. She thought about her mother and the flower stand they used to run. She missed those days. She missed the bright colors of the roses and lilies. She missed her mother's smile. "We can rebuild," Emmy said softly. Kenji looked at her. "What?" "We can rebuild," she said again, louder this time. "We have to. If we give up now, then everything we've lost will mean nothing." Kenji thought about her words. He wasn't sure if he believed her. How could they rebuild when everything was destroyed? But Emmy's voice gave him a tiny spark of hope. That night, the shelter was cold. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. Kenji and Emmy huddled together for warmth. Kenji couldn't sleep. He stared at the roof of the shelter, his mind racing. He thought about his parents. Were they gone forever? He thought about his home. Would he ever see it again? Beside him, Emmy finally drifted off. Her breathing was slow and steady. Kenji envied her. He wished he could sleep, even for a little while. The next morning, the survivors in the shelter began to stir. The sun rose slowly, casting a pale light over the ruined city. Kenji and Emmy stepped outside. The air was cool, and the ground was damp with dew. They could see the remains of Hiroshima in the distance, broken buildings, burned trees, smoke rising from the ashes. It was hard to look at, but they couldn't look away. "What do we do now?" Kenji asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "We survive," Emmy said. "One day at a time." Food was still hard to find. The survivors searched for anything edible, roots, leaves, even insects. Some people shared what little they had, others kept it for themselves. Kenji and Emmy worked together. They found a few scraps of bread and shared them. It wasn't much, but it kept them going. As the days passed, the people of Hiroshima began to rebuild. It was slow work. They cleared the rubble, piece by piece. They used what they could find to make new shelters. Kenji and Emmy helped. They carried wood and metal. Their small hands blistered from the work. It was hard, but it felt good to do something. One day, a man came to the shelter. He was wearing a uniform, but it wasn't a soldier's uniform. He introduced himself as a relief worker. "I'm here to help," he said. We'll bring food and medicine soon. Just hold on." The survivors listened to his words. Some nodded. Others didn't seem to believe him. They had heard promises before. But the man kept his word. A few days later, trucks arrived. They brought rice, soup, and clean water. They brought bandages and medicine for the sick and injured. Kenji and Emmy ate their first full meal in weeks. The rice was plain, but it tasted like the best food they had ever eaten. The relief workers set up clinics to treat the survivors. Emmy watched as doctors bandaged burns and gave medicine to those with radiation sickness. She saw children her own age, thin and pale, but still smiling. It gave her hope. "We'll be okay," she said to Kenji one evening. Kenji didn't answer right away. He looked at the city where the first signs of rebuilding had begun. "Maybe," he said, "maybe we will." As the weeks turned into months, more help arrived. Volunteers came from other parts of Japan and even from other countries. They brought tools, supplies, and hope. Kenji and Emmy worked harder than ever. They helped plant new trees in the city. They carried bricks to build new homes. For the first time since the bombing, they began to feel a sense of purpose. Japan was broken, but its people refused to give up. They were tired and hungry, but they had hope. And hope, Kenji realized, was the first step to rebuilding. Chapter 9. The Voice of the World. The news of Hiroshima spread quickly. In newspapers, on radios, and in conversations, people talked about what had happened. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. It was hard to believe. Some called it a victory. In the United States, many believed the bomb had ended the war. They thought it had saved lives by forcing Japan to surrender. Soldiers who had fought long and hard felt relief. Families celebrated, hoping their loved ones would now come home. "Finally," they said, "the war is over." But not everyone felt the same. Others called it a tragedy. When people saw the pictures of Hiroshima, they couldn't look away. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Thousands of people were dead. Many more were hurt. In Japan, the reaction was one of shock. No one had ever seen destruction like this before. Survivors of the bomb described a terrible flash of light, intense heat, and buildings collapsing in an instant. They spoke of firestorms that swept through the city and the screams of people trying to escape. Many people in Hiroshima were sick. At first, they thought it was because of the burns and injuries. But then, even those who looked unharmed began to fall ill. Their hair fell out, their skin blistered. They grew weaker every day. This illness was new. Doctors didn't know how to treat it. They soon realized it was caused by radiation, an invisible poison left behind by the bomb. Survivors who seemed healthy were dying weeks or even months later. In Japan, people were horrified. They mourned the loss of so many lives. They asked, "Why did this happen?" Could it happen again? Around the world, leaders reacted. The United States explained why the bomb had been dropped. They said Japan would not surrender, and that using the bomb had ended the war quickly. But other countries began to ask questions. They saw the power of the atomic bomb and realized what it meant. This wasn't just a new weapon. It was something far more dangerous. Could this bomb be used on us? Some wondered. The Soviet Union, an ally during the war, watched closely. Its leaders were concerned. They knew the United States had a weapon unlike any other. They decided to build their own bomb. This was the beginning of a new kind of fear. A fear not of armies or tanks, but of total destruction. In Europe, people were divided. Some agreed with the United States, saying the bomb had ended a terrible war. Others believed it had gone too far. They thought about the innocent people who had died. Religious leaders around the world spoke out. Many called the bombing immoral. They said it was wrong to kill so many civilians, no matter the reason. Writers, artists, and thinkers began to reflect on what had happened. They created books, poems, and paintings about Hiroshima. Some works celebrated the end of the war. Others focused on the pain and suffering of the survivors. In the months after the bombing, reporters visited Hiroshima. They described what they saw: burned buildings, ash-covered streets, survivors wandering through the ruins, searching for family members. The smell of smoke and death lingered in the air. Photographs showed children with bandaged heads, mothers holding silent babies, and men sitting alone among the rubble. These images shocked the world. For many, these pictures were the first time they truly understood the power of the atomic bomb. The survivors of Hiroshima, known as Hibakusha, began to share their stories. Some traveled the world, speaking about their experiences. They described the flash of light, the heat, and the pain. They spoke of loved ones lost and homes destroyed. One survivor, a teacher, said, "I looked up and saw the sky turn white. Then everything around me was gone." Another, a child at the time, recalled, "My mother told me to run. I turned back to look at her, but she was gone." These stories moved people to tears. They also raised questions. Was it right to use such a weapon? Was there another way to end the war? Could it happen again? In the years that followed, Hiroshima became a symbol. It was a reminder of what could happen when humanity lost control. It was a warning about the dangers of war. The city itself began to rebuild, slowly but surely. But the scars of the bombing remained. Survivors carried their pain with them, both physical and emotional. Many felt guilt for surviving when so many others had died. In the United States, the scientists who had created the bomb began to speak out. Some felt proud, believing they had ended the war. Others felt deep regret. J. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the leading scientists, famously said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His words reflected the weight of what had been done. Across the globe, governments began to prepare for a new era. The United Nations, formed after the war, started discussions about nuclear weapons. They wanted to prevent another Hiroshima. But it wasn't easy. The United States, the Soviet Union, and other powerful nations started building more bombs. Each country wanted to be stronger than the others. This led to the Cold War, a period of tension and fear. People worried about the possibility of another atomic bomb, this time on a much larger scale. In schools, children practiced hiding under desks in case of a nuclear attack. Families built shelters in their homes. The fear of the bomb became a part of daily life. But even in this time of fear, there was hope. Survivors from Hiroshima continued to speak out. They urged the world to remember what had happened and to work for peace. One young survivor, Sadako Sasaki, became a symbol of hope. She was just 2 years old when the bomb fell. Years later, she developed radiation sickness. While in the hospital, she folded paper cranes, believing they would bring her health and peace. Sadako folded hundreds of cranes, but she passed away before reaching her goal of 1,000. Today, her story inspires people to work for a world without nuclear weapons. In Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial Park was built. It honors the victims of the bombing and reminds visitors of the importance of peace. The world learned many lessons from Hiroshima. Some were about science and technology. Others were about humanity and the cost of war. But the most important lesson was this: we must never forget. The voices of the survivors, the images of the city, and the memory of that terrible day remind us of what's at stake. They ask us to choose peace over conflict, hope over fear. And as long as people remember Hiroshima, there is a chance to build a better world. Chapter 10. A Broken Japan. On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. After years of fighting, bombing, and suffering, the country laid down its arms. People listened to the emperor's voice on the radio. It was the first time they had ever heard him speak. "We must endure the unendurable," he said. His words were calm, but they carried the weight of defeat. For many, it didn't feel like the end of the war. It felt like the beginning of something else, something harder. Japan was broken. Cities across the country were in ruins. Tokyo, once bustling with life, was now a sea of ashes. Osaka, Nagoya, and Yokohama had also been heavily bombed. And Hiroshima? Hiroshima was gone. Everywhere, people were starving. The war had taken everything: homes, food, and hope. Families waited in long lines for small amounts of rice. Others searched fields for roots or leaves to eat. Kenji and Emi were among the survivors. They sat in a small shelter made of broken wood and scraps of metal. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping outside. Inside the shelter, there were other survivors too. Some were elderly, others were young, like Kenji and Emi. They all shared the same haunted look Their faces were pale, their eyes were tired. Kenji held his knees to his chest. He was hungry, and his stomach growled loudly. "When will there be more food?" he asked. "I don't know," Emmy said. Her voice was soft. She was hungry too, but she tried not to show it. Kenji sighed. "I wish we could go home." "This is home now," Emmy said, looking around the shelter. The walls were uneven, and the roof leaked when it rained, but it was the only place they had. Outside, the air was cool. The ground was still blackened from the fires that had burned after the bomb. The streets of Hiroshima were quiet, except for the sound of people searching through rubble. Every day, survivors walked through the ruins, looking for anything useful. Some searched for food or clean water. Others looked for loved ones. "Have you seen my son?" one woman asked as she passed the shelter. Her voice was shaky. She held a small photograph in her hands. Kenji watched her go. He thought of his parents and wondered if they were still alive. He missed them so much it hurt. Emmy sat next to him, her hands folded in her lap. She was holding a flower, a small one she had found growing near the river. It was the only sign of life she had seen in days. "We can rebuild," she said suddenly. Kenji turned to her. "What?" "We can rebuild," she repeated. Her voice was stronger this time. "We have to. If we don't, who will?" Kenji frowned. "How? Everything's gone." Emmy looked at the flower in her hands. "Not everything," she said. "We're still here, and as long as we're alive, we can start again." Kenji didn't answer. He wanted to believe her, but it seemed impossible. The city was destroyed. How could they rebuild when they had nothing? That night, the shelter was cold. The wind blew through the cracks in the walls. Kenji and Emmy huddled together for warmth. Kenji couldn't sleep. His mind was full of questions. What would they eat tomorrow? Where would they go? Was there any hope left? Emmy fell asleep first. Her breathing was slow and steady. Kenji listened to it, trying to calm his own racing thoughts. The next morning, they woke to the sound of footsteps outside the shelter. A group of people was walking through the streets, carrying tools and supplies. "Who are they?" Kenji asked. "They're here to help," one of the adults in the shelter said. The group was made up of volunteers, people from other parts of Japan who had come to help Hiroshima. They brought food, medicine, and building materials. For the first time in weeks, Kenji and Emmy had a full meal. It was just rice and soup, but it tasted like a feast. The volunteers set up clinics to treat the sick and injured. They gave bandages to those with burns and medicine to those with radiation sickness. Emmy watched as a doctor helped an old man wrap his burned hands. The man winced in pain, but he thanked the doctor with a small bow. Kenji and Emmy joined the effort to rebuild. They worked alongside the adults, carrying wood and bricks. It was hard, and their hands were blistered by the end of the day. But it felt good to do something. Slowly, the city began to change. Rubble was cleared away. Small homes were built. People started planting seeds in the blackened soil. One day, Kenji and Emmy went to the river. The water was still dark, but a few fish swam near the surface. Kenji smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe Emmy's right, he thought. Maybe we can rebuild. As the weeks turned into months, more help arrived. Trucks brought supplies from other countries. Relief workers handed out blankets, clothing, and tools. Emmy folded paper cranes in her free time. Each one was a symbol of hope. She taught Kenji how to fold them too. Soon, their shelter was filled with colorful cranes hanging from the ceiling. "We'll be okay," Emmy said one evening as they watched the sunset. Kenji looked at the city, where new homes were being built. He thought about everything they had lost, but he also thought about what they still had, each other. "Maybe we will," he said softly. Japan was broken, but its people were not. They were hungry and tired, but they didn't give up. Together, they worked to rebuild their lives, one day at a time. And in the ashes of Hiroshima, hope began to grow. Chapter 11. Rising from the Ashes. Years passed. Slowly, Hiroshima began to heal. At first, it seemed impossible. The city had been destroyed, the ground was blackened, the air smelled of smoke. Survivors were tired, sick, and grieving. But they did not give up. They cleared the rubble, piece by piece. They carried bricks, wood, and stone. They worked with their hands, even when their bodies were weak. It was slow, hard work, but it was also hopeful. New homes were built where ruins once stood. Small houses at first, with tin roofs and wooden walls. Later, larger buildings rose, factories reopened, shops appeared on street corners. Life began to return to the city. Kenji grew up in this new Hiroshima. He remembered the destruction, but he also saw the rebuilding. He watched as trees sprouted where ashes had fallen. The green leaves seemed brighter than ever. Flowers bloomed along the river banks. Kenji went back to school. His classroom was small, but he was happy to learn again. He made new friends and dreamed of the future. Emmy worked hard too. She became a teacher, helping young children who had lost so much. Her students laughed and played, their voices filling the quiet streets. Emmy smiled when she saw them. She believed they were the key to a better future. The people of Hiroshima didn't forget what had happened. They couldn't. The memories were too strong. Survivors shared their stories. They spoke about the flash of light, the burning heat, and the silence that followed. Some found it hard to talk about that day. The pain was still fresh, even years later. But others believed it was important to remember. They wanted the world to know. In the center of the city, a decision was made. A place would be built to honor the victims. It would also serve as a reminder, a promise to never let this happen again. The Peace Memorial Park was created. It stood where the bomb had exploded, in the heart of Hiroshima. The park was quiet, filled with trees and flowers. A river ran through it, reflecting the sunlight. In the park stood a building that had survived the bombing. Its walls were cracked, and its dome was broken. But it was still there. People called it the A-bomb dome. It became a symbol of both destruction and resilience. Nearby, a flame was lit. It was called the Flame of Peace. It would burn until the world was free of nuclear weapons. The Children's Peace Monument was also built. It was inspired by a young girl named Sadako Sasaki. She had been just 2 years old when the bomb fell. Years later, she became sick with radiation poisoning. While in the hospital, Sadako folded paper cranes. She believed that if she folded 1,000 cranes, her wish for health and peace would come true. Sadako didn't live to finish her cranes, but her story inspired millions. Today, people from all over the world bring paper cranes to Hiroshima. They hang them around the monument as a sign of hope. Kenji and Emmy often visited the Peace Memorial Park. They walked among the trees and sat by the river. They read the names of the victims written in stone. Kenji would sometimes close his eyes and remember that day. The flash, the roar, the smoke. But he also thought about how far the city had come. Hiroshima is alive, he said one day. Yes, Emmy replied, and it's up to us to keep it that way. Kenji decided to help in his own way. He became an architect, designing homes and schools for families in need. He wanted to rebuild the city, not just with bricks and wood, but with hope. Emmy continued teaching. She told her students about the bombing, but she also taught them about peace. Learn from the past, she said, but look to the future. The people of Hiroshima worked together to create a city of peace. They held ceremonies every year to remember the bombing. Bells rang out, and moments of silence were observed. Visitors came from all over the world to see Hiroshima. They walked through the Peace Memorial Park. They listened to the stories of survivors. Many left flowers or cranes as a sign of respect. Hiroshima's message spread far beyond Japan. It became a symbol of resilience, hope, and the importance of peace. But the city's journey wasn't easy. Radiation sickness continued to affect survivors. Some lived with pain for the rest of their lives. Others faced discrimination because they were hibakusha, people exposed to the bomb. Despite these challenges, the people of Hiroshima didn't give up. They believed their city had a mission: to remind the world of the dangers of war and the need for peace. Emmy often told her students, "Hiroshima is not just a city. It is a lesson." Kenji agreed. "We must never forget," he said. Years turned into decades. Hiroshima grew stronger, but its history was always present. The A-bomb dome stood as a silent witness to the past. The Peace Memorial Park welcomed new generations who came to learn and remember. Kenji and Emmy lived full lives. They saw the city change, but they also saw